There are two types of people who rob banks. The first kind storms in, mask on, gun out, yelling like they're auditioning for an unlicensed Ocean's 11 reboot. The second kind wears khakis, politely asks for a withdrawal slip, and disappears into traffic before anyone realizes what happened. Our story concerns the second kind specifically. One man who robbed over 100 banks and did it so quietly. Most people still don't believe he existed. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you really like what I do here. Also, post your location and local time in the comments. I like to know where my fellow insomniacs are tuning in from. Now, if you're wondering how someone could rob that many banks without a ski mask, a getaway car, or a cool hacker sidekick named Raven, well, the answer involves psychology, teabags, and an unsettling knowledge of floor plans. As they say in the sleepy suburbs of Ohio, you never really know your neighbors, until you find out one of them's been living like a ghost with a pension for Wells Fargo. It started, as these stories often do, with absolutely nothing suspicious at all. Harold Smithe, yes, with an E at the end, lived on a quiet cul-de-sac in Reynoldsburg, Ohio. If beige were a person, it would have been Harold. He drove a tan Toyota Corolla. He wore polos tucked into pleated khakis. His favorite phrase was, "Can't complain," and his front lawn was maintained with militaristic precision. The only odd thing was that Harold never seemed to go to work, but he also never seemed to be home. Neighbors speculated wildly, as suburbs do. Some thought he worked nights. Others figured he had a remote tech job. Or maybe he was an insurance adjuster, which is basically the same as being a vampire, but for spreadsheets. In truth, Harold was working. He just wasn't employed. Or rather, his job involved quietly robbing regional banks across state lines with the enthusiasm of a man checking items off a very boring bucket list. The first hint that something was off came not from a detective, but from a chatty mailman named Doug, who happened to be on a trivia team. Doug liked patterns. He liked routines, and Harold had none. Sometimes his mail stacks up for a week. Doug noted during a particularly dull trivia night. Then it's like he's back for 2 days, then gone again. No one works like that. To most people, this would sound like a guy who travels a lot for work. But Doug, bless his conspiracy podcast heart, took this as evidence of something sinister. He's either in the CIA or a serial killer, he whispered to his trivia team. He was only half wrong. Meanwhile, bank robbery statistics in the Midwest were starting to get weird. Usually, when a bank is robbed, it's a loud event. Cops are called. Footage is reviewed. Anxious tellers recount the traumatic events. But in 12 different cities, across 5 states, there had been a string of robberies described as gentle. In each case, a man walked in, mid-40s, average build, no mask, no gun. He'd wait in line, smile, pass a note, then leave. No one screamed, no dye packs exploded, no fingerprints left behind. Surveillance footage showed a man so unremarkable, he might as well have been the store-brand version of a human being. These weren't huge scores, a few thousand here, 10 grand there. But the frequency was strange. One robbery every 6 to 8 days, never in the same city twice. Always at banks with understaffed branches and lax internal protocols. Harold's brilliance wasn't in the execution. It was in the boredom. He was dull, painfully so. No one wants to remember the man who smells faintly of lemon cleaner and hands you a note asking for $4,000 in 20s and 50s. Please, no dye packs or bait bills. Thank you kindly. It wasn't until robbery 37 that the pattern truly emerged. A bored teller Brittany, 27 future microbrewery owner, noticed that the handwriting on the note matched a withdrawal slip from another branch she used to work at in Cincinnati. She filed a report. No one listened, until Glenn Withers got involved. But we'll get to Glenn in a bit. The real kicker. Harold was a member of the HOA. He once led the vote on mailbox uniformity. He barbecued, He never missed garbage day. If you looked up inoffensive American male in a psychology textbook, Harold's photo would be next to a recipe for tuna salad. True historical fact. In the 1980s, the FBI introduced the concept of criminal signature behavioral patterns that link a person to their crimes. Harold's signature was a lack of one. By the end of year 2, he'd robbed 51 banks. No arrests, no car chases. Just a rising sense among junior analysts at the Federal Reserve that something weird was going on. Meanwhile, Harold was back home in Reynoldsburg, eating oatmeal with flaxseed and watching reruns of Antiques Roadshow. He had a theory that expensive furniture could teach you more about human ambition than any philosophy course ever could. He once told his neighbor, "People don't look up. You'd be amazed how much you can do if you just never wear red and never look hurried." She thought it was dating advice. He was talking about robbing banks. Modern debate alert philosophers have long argued about the invisibility of the ordinary. When someone is truly average in every visible way, do they, in a sense, cease to be perceived at all? Harold would say yes, and then politely ask if you'd like decaf or herbal. We'll get to how it all unraveled later. For now, just remember, every great criminal mastermind starts somewhere. Harold started with beige khakis and a travel rewards card, and like most suburban legends, no one believed in him until it was way too late. There are routines, and then there are Harold Smithe's routines. If you asked any of his neighbors, they'd have told you he was a man of habit. Same grocery day Wednesday, same walking route clockwise, never counter, same gardening hour, Orzur Penthas ma. Sharp. But what no one noticed, except, eventually, the federal government, was that Harold's true routine was carefully designed to not be a routine at all. Let's go back 6 months before his first near slip. It was March, one of those Ohio months that can't decide if it's still winter or already mud. Harold was seen at home 3 times that month. The rest of the time, he was 600 miles away, sipping hotel coffee and plotting the softest robberies in recorded history. He didn't rent cars. Too traceable. He didn't use his phone. Too trackable. He didn't even use the same suitcase twice. At thrift stores in random cities, he'd buy a new bag, always bland, always ugly. Then he'd toss it after one use, often donating it again, a kind of karmic luggage laundering. And here's where it gets clever. Harold never robbed banks in a pattern recognizable to ordinary software. He didn't follow geographic clusters or population density. He targeted financial institutions based on internal vulnerability, low staff turnover, poor surveillance placement, weak panic procedures, things only an insider might know. It turns out, Harold wasn't just a guy who liked banks. He had once worked for one. Fact time. In the 1990s, Harold had been an internal systems auditor for a mid-size regional bank. You know, the kind of guy who reads the branch compliance manual cover to cover and can explain why the panic button is sometimes disconnected during remodeling. He didn't quit in disgrace. He quit because the bank folded during the subprime chaos, and something about that lit a very beige fire in him. Here's the thing, Harold believed banks had forgotten what they were supposed to be. A vault, he once muttered to himself while peeling an orange in a motel room, should not be shaped like a suggestion box. So he designed a life of calculated fluidity. While his neighbors thought he was tending to begonias, Harold was 400 miles south, politely asking a teller for $7,300 in unmarked bills. A typical day on the job went like this. Wake at 5:00 m. Change into pre-ironed, pre-selected outfit. Dull blue, short sleeves, deodorant ambiguous. Walk into bank between 9:15 and 10:00. Ma'am. Choose the teller who looked the most likely to cry under pressure. Smile. Pass the note. Leave in under 3 minutes. Hit the bus station. Switch jackets. Dispose of note. Eat a muffin. Disappear. His travel planning was absurdly meticulous. Harold maintained a notebook, not digital, just an old-school paper moleskin where he cross-referenced bank holiday closures. teller lunch schedules, and peak traffic hours for 3 cities at a time. Each page looked like the fever dreams of a conspiracy theorist. Color-coded tabs. Marginalia, like Springfield branch, tends to forget to calibrate cameras after daylight saving. Here's where philosophy pops in again. Scholars of cognitive criminology have long debated whether successful criminal behavior stems more from intelligence or obsessive behavior. Harold made a strong case for both, and also for the weird power of being aggressively average. When he wasn't robbing banks, he spent hours blending back into domestic normalcy. Book club, he never read the books. Trivia night, he always lost on purpose. He volunteered at the library. He even joined a community garden, where he specialized in root vegetables and paranoia. But every pattern Harold built for his public life, he consciously broke in his private one. He never used the same city twice in a month. Never slept in the same hotel chain more than once in a quarter. Never spent more than 16 minutes inside a bank. And always walked out as if he had forgotten something small but unimportant. Which brings us to his growing file at the FBI. At first, the cases were handled locally. Small-town police departments wrote them off as isolated incidents, odd robberies with no real evidence, no fingerprints, no threats, no surveillance clarity. But once the number ticked past 30, a few junior analysts started to get itchy. There was a commonality they couldn't name, not in the robberies themselves, but in the silence surrounding them. Every teller described the man as mild, apologetic, or in one case, like if a sock became sentient and politely asked for your wallet. And then came the incident in Peoria, Bank Truck 43, a rainy Thursday. Harold passed the note as usual. The teller, a nervous intern named Jules, noticed the man was left-handed. She handed him the cash with her own left hand out of reflex. Harold, unthinking, took it with his right. Later, when reviewing footage, Jules couldn't say what was wrong. He switched hands. She mumbled. It was weird. That footage made it to an analyst in a regional office. The analyst, who also happened to be a failed magician, noticed something stranger. Harold was subtly obscuring his face during the handoff, using what stage magicians call gesture misdirection. He had never trained with Penn and Teller, but he'd watched enough of their DVDs. By the way, true scientific fact, studies in facial recognition show that people recall faces significantly less accurately when there's even brief hand movement near the eyes. Harold weaponized that fact with librarian-grade politeness. But the problem with genius is repetition. Repetition breeds recognition. By the time Robbery Dutch 50 hit the books, 2 separate agencies were creating pattern models, and both kept flagging the same behavior a man too normal to be real. Back in Reynoldsburg, Harold received a coupon in the mail. Buy one, get one muffin. He smiled. He clipped it. He made tea. The news was talking about cryptocurrencies and bird flu. No one mentioned him. His khakis were pressed. His moleskin was full. He circled a date on his calendar in red ink, his only splash of color in 6 years. Coming up next, the detective who could solve crosswords in pen and whose cinnamon roll addiction would change everything. If you've ever met someone who solves the Sunday crossword in ink, you know 2 things. 1, they are an intellectual menace, and 2, they never let it go. Glenn Withers was exactly that kind of menace. A retired FBI analyst with a bald spot shaped suspiciously like the state of Iowa, and a deep mistrust of kale. Glenn had spent 32 years profiling bank robbers, con artists, and embezzlers with obscure hobbies. He lived alone with 2 cats, one named Occam, the other Paradox, and spent his afternoons annotating crossword puzzles like they were crime scenes. Glenn's second passion, equal only to deconstructing criminal psychology, was cinnamon rolls. Not just any cinnamon rolls, only the ones from Gracie's Griddle, a roadside bakery off I-70 that Glenn insisted had cracked the sugar glaze code sometime in the 90s and had never looked back. So when Glenn received an unsolicited email from a former colleague's subject line, "Ever see a man rob 60 banks and get rated 5 stars for customer service?" he nearly choked on his breakfast roll. The email was short. No attachments. Just a copy-pasted string of summaries from 14 bank robbery reports. They all read like customer satisfaction surveys gone rogue. He thanked me after I gave him the cash. He said, "Please." No weapon. Kind eyes. Smelled like mint shampoo. At first, Glenn thought it was a joke. Then he noticed a detail that made him freeze mid-bite the timing. Each robbery occurred within 36 to 48 hours of the previous one, and each one was just far enough away that a commercial flight wouldn't make sense. Too expensive, too traceable. But there was one method of travel that was cheap, anonymous, and built on chaos long-distance bus routes. Now, Glenn wasn't a bus guy. He liked his seatbelts, and his patience was optimized for crossword clues, not crying babies and sticky armrests. But he knew enough to know that Greyhound was the Wild West of transit. Tickets could be bought with cash, IDs weren't always checked, and no one, not even Homeland Security, kept reliable records of people who used $3 transfer vouchers. That's when he noticed another thing. The bank robber, whoever he was, didn't hit banks near airports. He hit banks near bus depots. Within a week, Glenn had a whiteboard covered in tiny bus logos, dates, and city names, arranged like an obsessive college football bracket. Each confirmed robbery was linked to a nearby station with a colored string yellow for weekday, red for weekend, and blue for weird behavior reported by teller. The board looked like a conspiracy theorist's fever dream, which, in fairness, it was. As Glenn dove deeper, he started to notice a pattern of absence. Not what the man did, but what he didn't do. No fingerprints, no raised voices, no demands for specific amounts, no notes reused, no disguises, no known aliases. In criminal psychology, they call this conspicuous minimalism. It's rare. Most criminals either evolve over time, getting sloppier, more aggressive, or they start taking trophies. But this guy, he was a ghost in khakis. Curiously, Glenn found a secondary pattern, even weirder than the robberies themselves. In at least 9 cases, tellers described the man as looking vaguely familiar, not like a regular customer, but someone I swear I've seen before. One even said, like a guy in a commercial. Maybe laundry detergent. That's when Glenn laughed, because he had a theory. A weird, cinnamon sugar-fueled theory. Harold Smithe didn't have a criminal signature. He had an anti-signature. He leaned so hard into average, he became cinematically generic, the perfect extra. The guy you cast to sit in the background of a car insurance commercial so no one remembers his face. Here's a weird fact. Facial perception studies show people more easily remember faces that are asymmetrical or distinctive. Harold's face. Pure oatmeal. 2 eyes. Decent nose. Slightly thinning hair. The cheekbones of a substitute gym teacher. He'd probably been ID'd correctly more times before he started robbing banks. Glenn ran the theory by his former supervisor, now teaching at a community college in Delaware. "Sounds like you're describing a human CAPTCHA," the supervisor said. "A test to see if people can detect threat in the absence of threat cues." "Exactly," Glenn said, mouthful of day-old roll. "He's the human version of elevator music. He's everywhere, and no one sees him." Now came the next piece, surveillance footage. Glenn called in a few favors and got access to a handful of robbery videos that hadn't been made public. He watched them, one by one, late at night, the soft purr of Occam and Paradox echoing in the background. Each time, he noticed the same thing. Harold, though they didn't know his name, yet entered the bank at precisely the time between morning rush and lunch hour. He made sure to stand in line. He never approached an open teller. He always waited his turn. And the most remarkable thing, he smiled. A soft, slightly apologetic, dad joke smile. The kind that says, "Hey, sorry to be a bother, but I'm going to need all the money in that drawer. Please, Thank you. And have a nice day. Glenn circled that smile in freeze frame. That, he said aloud, is the most dangerous smile I've ever seen. Then came the true clincher. In a video from a bank in Indianapolis, Glenn spotted a reflection small, subtle, in the convex security mirror near the ceiling. It was Harold reaching into his pocket for the note. The angle was warped, but Glenn could see it clearly. Harold used 2 fingers to slide the note out. He looked down, blinked slowly twice, and then tilted his head exactly 15 degrees. It was the same exact motion in every video, every single one. Not only did Harold have a script, he had choreography. That's stagecraft, Glenn whispered. He'd seen it before. In the Bureau's behavioral training videos, criminals who rehearse their mannerisms to avoid nervous tells. But Harold had gone further. He'd rehearsed neutrality. Quirky detail time. Glenn once took an acting class in retirement to understand liars better. He flunked out because he couldn't do improv without quoting tax law, but that course gave him one insight. Every actor has a default expression, a resting mask. Harold had chosen his calm, approachable, a little forgettable. It was a masterpiece of human camouflage. The final clue that cemented Glenn's obsession came via a database search of unsolved cases marked anomalous customer behavior. There were 16 across the Midwest, none technically classified as robberies, just oddities, cash drawers lighter than expected, teller memories foggy, surveillance footage smudged or misaligned, 16 non-crimes, all within a Greyhound day trip of each other. Oh, Glenn muttered, rising from his desk and dropping a sticky cinnamon roll onto Paradox's tail. You're not just a thief, you're a damn ghost with a bus pass. And with that, Glenn packed a bag, circled 3 cities, and started tracing the scent of the world's politest criminal. Let's get one thing straight. Harold Smithe never wore a mask. Not once. Not a ski mask. Not a Halloween mask. Not even one of those flimsy surgical ones people pretend work miracles in checkout lines. And yet, in over 100 robberies, not a single person could accurately describe his face. You might think that's just incompetence, or maybe fear fogging memory. But no. It was deliberate. Harold didn't need to hide. He just needed to make sure no one was looking in the first place. Enter the fascinating, real-world principle of aperture blindness, a known phenomenon in optical engineering. When security cameras are pointed just slightly downward or into strong light, their aperture can be blinded to details like facial features, especially if movement draws the eye elsewhere. Harold didn't invent this glitch. He just used it like a symphony conductor with a psychology degree and a grudge against financial institutions. Here's how it played out. Security footage from Bank Sacre 58 in St. Louis showed Harold walking in under the glare of high mid-morning sun. The camera, poorly positioned, caught mostly a glint of his balding head and a lot of ceiling tile. When investigators zoomed in, all they got was a light blur and a ghostly smudge of khaki. It could have been anyone from your dentist to your disappointed uncle who only ever texts K. And that was the point. Harold didn't wear disguises. He wore misdirection. Think of it like stage magic, but less sparkle and more customer service chic. He carried a leather messenger bag, not flashy, not worn just enough to look like he sold insurance to other people who sold insurance. He'd adjust his glasses while speaking, block his face while reaching for something, and always hand the note at an angle, covering the security camera's direct view. True fact alert. According to a 2017 study, most people unconsciously mirror body language during face-to-face interactions. Harold used this to his advantage. When he leaned forward, tellers leaned back. When he made himself small, they became bigger and more visible on camera. Every reaction was calculated. It was behavioral choreography. No threatening words. No weapons. Just suggestions. His notes read like polite post-it requests. Good morning. I need the cash from your drawer. Please. Quietly. No alarms. No dies. "You're doing great." Once, at Bank Suckers 72, he wrote a smiley face at the bottom. The teller later admitted she was honestly kind of comforted. But for all his control, Harold had rules. No banks with guards, no armored truck schedules, no repeat cities. He'd pre-visit branches weeks in advance, disguised only as a mildly underpaid customer asking about opening a checking account. He never gave a real name. He never gave off the vibe of a man casing a joint, more like someone who once got scammed by overdraft fees and still harbored gentle trauma. And then there were the door frames. Here's where things get weird. In footage from a Michigan branch, Glenn Withers noticed that Harold always paused just slightly at the threshold, like a tick. A millisecond hesitation, just enough to adjust his stride. Glenn cross-referenced 5 other videos. Same move. Every time. Why? Because Harold had measured the exact camera delay between motion sensors triggering and recording beginning. By pausing for just a moment, he ensured the camera wouldn't catch his full entrance, only his back. It was a subtle trick. Not even most professionals noticed it. But Glenn did. He began to chart the average camera delay across different banks, marking a new section of his cinnamon roll-stained whiteboard with the label Blind Entry Theory. That wasn't the only optical trick in Harold's pocket. Once, at a particularly outdated branch in Kentucky, he wore a shirt the exact same hue as the wall behind the teller. Color blending. Not camouflage, palette camouflage. When zoomed footage was reviewed later, his outline blurred. "Literally, that's not a guy," one analyst muttered, squinting at the screen. "That's a beige spirit." Theories within the FBI began to diverge. Some claimed Harold was ex-military intelligence. Others were sure he was a disgraced magician. One intern proposed he might be an AI field test gone rogue. But Glenn, with his crossword brain and carb-fueled instincts, knew better. This is a man who studied boredom like it was a martial art. He told his cat, Paradox. One late evening, he turned being forgettable into a weapon. Let's drop another true historical nugget here. In 2002, researchers at MIT proved that most people fail to recall the faces of those they consider non-threatening or socially irrelevant. Harold took that principle and marinated in it, which brings us to the gas station receipts. During a cross-check of regional credit card transactions, a single anomaly appeared: a 9.73 gas station purchase at a rest stop, 11 minutes from Bank 61, paid in cash. That's not suspicious in itself. But the cashier noted something peculiar. The man had asked if the security camera was working, because he didn't want to end up in some TikTok. The camera, incidentally, was broken, and the cashier remembered his face only because of the awkward joke. For Harold, humor wasn't accidental. It was intentional disarming, the psychological equivalent of spraying Febreze on a burning couch. He told jokes about airline food, the DMV, and once at Bank 66 quipped, "You know it's bad when your savings account needs a savings account." The teller laughed. Then she handed over $8,500 in small bills. Experts still debate, was Harold's charisma real, or just calculated? Was he sociopathic, or just emotionally efficient? The academic community remained split, though one criminal sociologist simply labeled him Midwestern Zen. And through all of it, Harold remained eerily calm. He practiced breathing techniques, yoga stretches, even blink timing to reduce physiological signs of nervousness. He was a man who could be in the middle of a felony and still remember to breathe from his diaphragm. One time, while leaving a bank in Arkansas, he stopped to pet a dog. The security footage captured it a simple, slow head pat, a moment so aggressively wholesome that the responding officer wrote in his report, "Honestly, didn't seem like the guy who robbed us." He wasn't the guy. He was every guy. The commuter, the gym member, the man ahead of you in line buying batteries, the one you definitely wouldn't remember 5 minutes later. And it was that forgettability that made him unstoppable. Until, of course, the day someone remembered him. But that's for later. Harold Smithe had made 42 clean exits, 42 polite notes, 42 instances of complete invisibility wrapped in slacks and social niceties. But Bank Xavier 43 was different. Not louder, not messier, just slightly off. And, as it turns out, when your whole criminal empire is built on predictability, even a small deviation can echo like a drum. It happened in Peoria, Illinois, on an overcast Thursday, the kind of day that looks like it came pre-filtered in grayscale. The air smelled like damp sidewalk and mild disappointment. And inside the branch, the staff was slogging through a long morning of awkward mortgage questions and coffee that tasted like regret. Harold arrived at exactly 9:47 am, wearing the usual khakis, collared shirt, expression that said assistant manager at a hardware store. His steps were calm, his hands visible, his breath measured. He queued like everyone else, waited patiently, even commented that the Muzak version of Fleetwood Mac playing overhead was a bit ambitious for this hour. He handed the note to the teller. Jules, 22, fresh out of community college, working this job while trying to decide if she actually wanted to become a CPA or just marry someone who already was. She wasn't seasoned, but she was observant. The note was the same as always. No threats. Just, "Good morning. I need the cash from your drawer. Please, quietly. No alarms." "You're doing fine." She blinked, nodded. Her training kicked in. She opened the drawer, began stacking bills, but then something odd happened. Harold reached for the cash with his right hand. Now, that doesn't sound suspicious unless you've spent the last 20 minutes watching this man fill out forms, scratch his chin, and adjust his glasses all with his left. Jules noticed, not consciously. It was a gut-level twitch, like when you see a dog walk backward or your friend says LOL out loud. Just wrong. Still, she gave him the money. Still, he left without incident. But her curiosity was lit. Later, she mentioned it in the branch debrief, offhand, and he switched hands, like left, 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 and then suddenly right. Weird. Most supervisors would have shrugged it off. But hers Allison Chung was a recovering conspiracy theorist who still believed Denver Airport housed a secret society. She flagged the footage. Meanwhile, Glenn Withers' cinnamon roll smeared on his keyboard. Crossword Half Solved was cataloging reports of unusual teller behavior across the Midwest when a new keyword pinged handed note with left hand. Took cash with right. That flag hadn't existed before. Glenn had just added it to his database the night prior. It was a long shot, a wild hypothesis. But suddenly, Bank 043 was the first confirmed yes. He leaned back in his chair, flung a paperclip into a coffee mug, and said aloud, "The symmetry's breaking." Because here's what Glenn knew, and what the public didn't. Criminals with high-pattern discipline tend to make mistakes, not because of stress, but because of fatigue. Not physical fatigue, narrative fatigue. Harold's story, up to that point, had been so consistent it bordered on religious. But in Peoria, something cracked. Maybe his shoulder hurt. Maybe he was distracted by the oddly low ceiling tiles. Maybe the teller reminded him of someone. Doesn't matter. The mask slipped, if only by an inch. From that inch, Glenn constructed a mile. He requested full footage of the Peoria incident. Not just the camera above Harold, all of them. Lobby, hallway, exit, even parking lot. And there, in frame, 6732, a glimmer. Harold stepped outside, turned slightly just enough to catch a reflection in the bank's automatic glass doors. A perfect reflection of his face. Not distorted, not angled, just a clean shot. Glenn called in a favor. The image was run through facial recognition software cross-referenced with DMV photos, census data, and something charmingly labeled Obscure Bingo Club registrations. Only one match came up, Harold E. Smithe, age 48, Reynoldsburg, Ohio. An unremarkable man with a zero-debt credit record, no social media, a Costco membership, and an alarmingly detailed Amazon purchase history that included 5 types of beige socks, and a book titled The Tao of Non-Threatening Eye Contact. Here's your quirky side detail. Harold once purchased 12 travel toothbrushes in a single order. Either he was a germaphobe or very committed to never reusing anything identifiable. But Glenn didn't celebrate. He frowned. That was too easy. He muttered, because even though the facial recognition pinged, nothing else matched up. No travel history, no hotel bookings, no flagged credit card use, not even suspicious garbage pickup data. Yes. Glenn checked his trash days. It was like Harold existed in paperwork, but not in real space, until Glenn thought to check Greyhound ticket records, not under Harold's name, but under Harold's neighbors' names, and their neighbors, and former co-workers. He discovered a pattern of bus tickets booked under real names of real people who wouldn't notice or care about a 38 transaction. You'd be amazed how easy it is to use a dead man's frequent traveler number when they never used it in the first place. This was called the shadow loop, a travel method used by certain undocumented migrants and Cold War-era agents. It hadn't been relevant in decades. Harold had resurrected it, slapped on a pair of prescription readers, and turned it into a logistics ballet. Back in Reynoldsburg, Harold was trimming his hedges, or rather, pretending to. The trimmer wasn't plugged in. It was a prop. Across the street, a new car had parked. Inside it sat Glenn Withers. He wasn't there to confront. He was there to watch. Observe long enough, Glenn said into his recorder. And even ghosts start to cast shadows. For the first time in his life, Glenn felt unsure. Not about the facts. Those were lining up too cleanly. But about the man behind them. Because Harold wasn't rich. He wasn't reckless. He didn't flaunt. He barely spent the money. What kind of criminal robs over 100 banks and then clips grocery coupons? The answer was close. Too close. In a week, Harold would make another move, and for the first time, someone would already be watching. It's a common misconception that all bank robbers are adrenaline junkies, that they crave the rush, the chaos, the sirens in the distance, and the taste of sweaty triumph. But Harold Smithe, he preferred chamomile tea, soft jazz, and 9:45 Mao. That's when the tellers are awake, but not tired. The managers are in meetings, and the bank lobby smells faintly of printer toner and artificial potted plants. What Harold pulled off at each robbery wasn't just a crime, it was a performance. Not a dramatic one. Not Broadway. More like community theater meets mindfulness seminar. Let's take a deeper look at his method. Imagine you're working at a small-town bank. It's Wednesday. You've had 2 people ask to withdraw $3 in coins. You're thinking about whether your leftover tuna sandwich is still okay. And then in walks Harold. He waits in line. He checks his watch. He smiles, but not too much, just enough to say, "I'm a man who makes small talk in elevators." When he reaches your window, he gives you a folded note. You glance down and see, "Good morning. Please place the loose bills from your drawer into this envelope. No alarm, no sudden moves. You're doing fine. Thank you." There's no gun, no raised voice. He hasn't even stepped closer than regulation customer distance. You pause. He doesn't. He simply waits. That stillness is powerful. Not menacing. Just unnervingly calm. Like a man who's done this before, and not in a panicky, desperate way, but like someone submitting a timesheet. You open the drawer. You count quickly. You slide the bills across. He places them in his leather envelope. You hear the faintest rustle. His sleeves are too crisp. He nods, says, "Thank you," and walks out. The entire thing takes less time than a sneeze. By the time the manager returns from yelling at a printer upstairs, Harold is 2 blocks away, casually ordering green tea at a cafe where he's already paid in cash and tipped generously. Now here's where things get deeply ironic. More than one teller rated Harold's demeanor as comforting, not charming, not scary. Comforting. That came out of post-incident interviews. One said, "He reminded me of my uncle who always forgets where he parked." Another said, "Honestly, I wasn't even sure if it was a robbery. They checked the drawers." A behavioral psychologist later remarked that Harold had successfully weaponized disarming politeness. There's ongoing academic debate about whether calmness can be considered a form of coercion when paired with expectation and social scripts. Harold didn't threaten. He implied. An implication, it turns out, is terrifyingly effective. There's a true fact buried in a dusty 2004 psychology paper. Humans are 60% more likely to comply with unusual requests if the person making them uses, "Please," seriously. That's it. The manners effect. Harold said please in 96% of his known notes, quirky aside. He also had very neat handwriting, slanted just a bit to the right, looped fetails, crossbars on the TS like a careful accountant. A handwriting analyst, yes. Glenn brought one in, described it as disciplined but emotionally reserved, which is also how a therapist once described Glenn on a first date. The lack of confrontation, the subdued tone, the ritual of it all. Harold made his robberies into a customer experience. He even chose banks with weak counter-to-exit angles. That's bank design speak for you can walk out quickly without bumping into a confused customer holding a lollipop. Part of his genius was anticipating panic before it happened. He prevented chaos by removing its trigger fear. There were no screams, no scrambling, just a slight chill in the air once people realized what had happened. One teller said, "It was like if someone came into your house, folded your laundry, and left with your TV. The numbers were small by Hollywood standards, $3,000, $7,200, occasionally a bold $10,000. But stack that up over 100 banks, and you've got yourself a career and a masterclass in under-the-radar crime." Investigators noticed that Harold never took bundles, only loose cash, no bait bills, no die packs. His note always specified loose bills, not rolled or pre-banded. That meant he knew how banks stored money. He knew which drawers held which denominations. That wasn't guessing. That was training. Back in the 90s, Harold had access to teller training manuals. Those boring 3-ring binders filled with phrases like, "Drawer A contains primary currency mix and eyes on customer posture during transaction." Most bankers forget that stuff the second they quit. Harold, he built a career on it. Then there was the T. Harold developed a pattern in the weeks leading up to a robbery. He'd visit the branch casually, sometimes twice, not too close together. He'd ask about account openings, business checking, or IRA transfers. Always something vague and adult-sounding. Then, about 3 days before the robbery, he'd return and ask if there were any coffee shops nearby. He'd chat with the teller, ask what she recommended, and sometimes, just sometimes, he'd stop in again without a bag, without paperwork, just to buy tea. Always green or chamomile. It became his calling card, not left at the scene, but embedded in memory. So when investigators began to triangulate behavior patterns, they didn't just track robbery times. They looked for tea-buying men who asked for directions 3 days before their bank got hit. That narrowed it down to about 5 guys. 2 of them were actual tea reps. One was just lonely. But one was Harold. Now here's where we get into the philosophical mud. Can a man who never yells, never hits, never threatens, never even insists, still be a criminal in the traditional sense? Some argue Harold's robberies were so nonviolent that they resembled requests, not crimes. Academics call this the consent illusion argument when social scripts are used so effectively. The victim consents out of politeness. But legally, yeah, it's still bank robbery. Harold never saw it that way. In one of the few notes he was rumored to have left behind, possibly on purpose, it simply said, "This is not theft. This is a withdrawal. I'm just not the one who opened the account. Poetic, if not legally helpful, and the mystery deepened when a security officer at Bank Dock 76 off-duty, watching from across the street, saw Harold exit and tip his head in a casual nod. It looked like he was saying, "Thanks for not noticing," the officer said later, which, incidentally, may have been the truest sentence of the entire case. Harold wasn't hiding. He was politely existing just outside your suspicion. Until, of course, someone noticed the pens. Pens, not lasers, not safes, not encrypted thumb drives or exotic French passports. Just a pen smooth, matte blue, with the faintest imprint of a conference logo would be the first physical object Harold ever took that he wasn't supposed to, and it would be the beginning of his unraveling. Bank Thucker 81, a modest branch tucked beside a Cracker Barrel in Kansas, had a reputation for being forgettable. Even its security guard once dozed off during a robbery drill. It was the kind of place you could enter, withdraw $300, and not remember if you'd gone at all. Naturally. Harold loved it. He executed his ritual flawlessly. Same time window, same tone, same note. The teller, young, mildly hungover, described him as less like a robber, more like an accountant apologizing for existing. Everything went as planned, until the pen. No one saw him take it. He didn't mean to. He was filling out a mock deposit slip as part of his exit misdirection routine, and out of old-fashioned habit, he just pocketed the pen. Harold was meticulous. But even meticulous men have lapses. Maybe it was the rainy weather. Maybe he was up late the night before re-ironing his khakis. Maybe his travel tea thermos leaked and he was slightly off rhythm. Regardless, the pen ended up in his bag. Here's the thing about branded conference pens. They're weirdly traceable. This one bore the faint inscription, Tri-State Finance Summit, 2011, Tulsa. A forgettable event, long past. But the marketing company that had printed those pens still in business, and still had inventory records. Enter Chloe Mathers. 23 intern at a regional insurance office in Topeka and self-proclaimed human spreadsheet. Chloe had a side project cross-referencing object anomalies in internal theft cases. Not because she was asked to, just because she found patterns relaxing. She noticed something strange in the Bank Sugar 81 inventory report. The standard issue pens should have all been black, but the one left behind, the one used for the deposit slip, was blue, slightly heavier. She flagged it in her internal file titled, Not My Job, But Still Fun, XLs. A week later, when local authorities compiled witness statements, her file got attached to a case bundle almost by accident. An officer named Dwight, tired, overworked, and 3 sips into a lukewarm energy drink skimmed the report and paused. "Where'd this blue pen come from?" he muttered. That's how the chain started. From the pen, they traced the brand. From the brand, they traced the order. From the order, they traced the distribution list and realized only one shipment of those pens had ever been sent to a marketing agency that serviced regional finance expos. One of those expos had been held in Ohio. One guest listed Harold Smithe back in 2011 when he was still doing consulting work. It was a needle in a haystack held together by coffee breath and petty obsession. But there it was. Glenn Withers, upon seeing this trail develop, didn't even smile. He just blinked slowly and whispered, "You brought a souvenir home." Rookie mistake. Because, you see, Harold never took. That was part of his whole philosophy. He extracted, gently. But the pen was ego, not arrogance per se, but nostalgia. A totem from a time before he became a walking philosophical riddle in orthopedic loafers. Let's take a detour here. There's an ongoing philosophical debate in criminal justice circles: is intent enhanced or diluted by ritual? When a person commits a crime methodically, devoid of passion or need, are they more culpable or less? Some argue ritual removes moral weight. Others say it's a sign of deep-rooted cognition, a belief system, not just behavior. Harold didn't rob banks for thrill. He robbed them because he believed they had wronged people like him quiet, invisible, dismissed. He once wrote in a note not given during a robbery, but found later in his travel journal, "They insured everything but us. Buildings, bonds, bonuses. Not people. Never people." Back to the pen. It ended up in a security evidence bag in Kansas, labeled Unusual Writing Instrument. Chloe, delighted, kept tabs on the investigation long after her internship ended. She would later write a memoir called Ink and Instinct: My Summer with a Ghost. But even with this breadcrumb, authorities were stuck. A pen isn't a warrant. It's barely a clue. It was Glenn with his crossword mind and archive of tea receipts who realized the pen matched the exact brand Harold had been using to write the robbery notes. In his deep dive of recovered notes, 28 of them. Total. Glenn had found subtle pressure imprints, micro indentations. He'd long suspected Harold favored a particular ballpoint model. Now, with this blue pen, he had proof. From there, Glenn triangulated store purchases, regional distributors, and because he had time-checked whether any of those pens had ever been sold near Harold's known haunts. Turns out, one had bought at a promotional booth at a county fair in 2012, a booth visited by Harold under his real name, and paid for in cash. Cash, yes, but the booth had taken photos. Harold, smiling, holding a tote bag, wearing a hat that read, "I heart budgeting." It was grainy, it was dorky, but it was him. This photo, paired with the Peoria reflection and the Greyhound logs, was enough for Glenn to build a case. Not airtight. Not yet. But close enough to whisper to his cat. He's not a ghost anymore. Here's your quirky side detail. The same conference that distributed the pen also gave out keychains shaped like tiny calculators. One was found in a lost and found bin in Cincinnati, wedged inside a copy of Zen and the Art of Motorcycle Maintenance. No fingerprints. But the receipt inside the book had a library barcode. Guess who had checked it out? Harold E. Smithe. Suddenly, a man who had never left a footprint was tripping over metaphors. By now, federal agents had a name, a photo, a behavioral profile, and 3 bizarre threads connecting him to crimes committed across 5 states. Still no hard evidence, but the pattern was tightening. The mask was slipping, and Harold was in a motel outside Springfield, ironing his shirt for what would be robbery Sakotract 84. He had no idea that 4 states away, someone was matching fonts on his notes to the same promotional pen, now locked in an evidence drawer. He just wanted to finish his tea. There are easier ways to rob a bank than what Harold Smithe was doing. He could have used a disguise, a decoy, a fake mustache, or a wig from Party City. But no, Harold preferred walking into a financial institution like he was attending a dental cleaning. Calm, casual, criminally courteous. By now, Harold had robbed 83 banks, give or take. But robbery number 84 at a sleepy bank in Missouri was about to become his most infamous. Not because of the amount stolen, a modest $6 as $800, or the speed 3 minutes flat, but because of the tea. Let's talk about the tea. In Harold's early robberies, he operated under a strict no flavors. No foam policy. Coffee was too volatile, and he loathed waiting in line behind someone ordering a seasonal latte with 7 adjectives. But somewhere between bank number 50 and number 60, Harold developed a ritual ordered tea after the job. Not before, not during, after. It gave him time to cool down, stay visible but unremarkable, and exit town under the warm illusion of harmless routine. Robbery Sucker Just 84 began like the others. Harold scoped the place 2 days prior, entered on a Wednesday at 9:42, and made polite conversation with a teller who looked like she'd rather be asleep. He passed the note, waited, collected the bills in a neat leather folder that once held tax documents, and turned to go. But on his way out, he paused. Across the street, inside a boutique cafe with a neon civility sign, He spotted a tea board so overwhelming, so aggressive, so comically specific it read like a stand-up routine. Jasmine citrus tranquility, mango Earl breakfast panic, chamomile rage blend, and the mysterious fog of war lapsang. Harold, who by all accounts had a weakness for mildly clever puns, couldn't resist. He crossed the street, still carrying the folder. That, dear listener, was a mistake. Inside, the barista Shauna, age 19, double majoring in linguistics and making very fast judgments, noticed two things. One, the man looked like someone who had just argued with a fax machine. Two, he ordered green tea, no lemon, and paid in cash using precisely folded tens. That would have been fine, except Shauna had also seen a man fitting his exact description on the news last week. A blurry image, part of a composite sketch the FBI had quietly circulated to banks and financial vendors under the internal tag Operation Beige Thunder. She didn't call the cops. Instead, she tweeted, "Is it just me, or did that bank robber from the Midwest just come in and order tea, like he's late for a PTA meeting?" Cheeks tea crimes. It went semi-viral. Not full viral. Not TikTok song and dance viral, but enough to trigger a keyword sweep viral, because Glenn Withers, bless his analog heart, had just convinced a team of interns at Quantico to run autofilters for social media mentions, combining tea, bank, and any synonyms for mild-looking. The tweet triggered a flag. The flag triggered an alert. The alert triggered Glenn's landline, which hadn't rung in months. "Get me the cafe's footage," he said, before biting into a cinnamon roll so stale it might have been a paperweight. Meanwhile, Harold sat at a window table sipping his tea, reading a pamphlet about herbalism and idly watching a pigeon attempt dominance over a sandwich wrapper. He stayed for 22 minutes. He didn't realize that, thanks to the tweet, local police were already investigating a report of a beige suspect with calming energy. The term used, unironically, by the 911 dispatcher was non-threatening vibe. Now here's the kicker when Harold left the cafe. He didn't go straight to the bus depot. He went to a second cafe, this one older, louder, stickier. There. He dropped $1 in a tip jar and complimented the coffee. Harold was planting decoys. That was his backup routine. Hit a branch. Then perform the most basic, unremarkable social routines in a second location to distort timelines. Surveillance footage later showed him walking down the street in one direction, then reappearing from the opposite side 15 minutes later. To this day, the theories range from mirror dimension to very fast jogger. But what Harold didn't know was that Shauna the barista had remembered something else, the folder. It was matte black, slim, slightly worn, and on the corner, there was a faded sticker, a logo, something odd, a squirrel. That squirrel turned out to be from a now-defunct financial education nonprofit that once gave Harold a guest-speaking slot in 2009, back when he was a systems consultant, lecturing on preventing low-impact fraud. Oh, the irony. That squirrel logo, once enhanced and cross-referenced, tied Harold to a real-world paper trail, a badge photo from the conference, a name tag, a signature on a W-9 form. Glenn got the footage, ran it against that image, and muttered, "Well, Harold, I hope the tea was worth it." Here's your true historical fact for this chapter. In 1986, a Soviet spy was caught not by surveillance, not by betrayal, but by a parking ticket. He'd parked in the same spot too often. Pattern kills the spy. And now, the tea threatened the thief. As Glenn wrote in his report, routine is the enemy of the professional. Harold got too cozy with his chamomile. Meanwhile, federal agents began zeroing in on travel paths near Springfield. Bus station logs were now on a delay. Harold had slipped away again. But this time, the scent was stronger. The clues were getting specific. Back in his motel, Harold sat on a floral bedspread sipping lukewarm water, unaware that a cafe tweet, a squirrel logo, and a blurry reflection had started to crystallize. He marked a new city in his notebook. City at hours are 85. What he didn't realize, what no one realized, was that someone else was now robbing banks in his style. And that, dear friends, imitation may be the sincerest form of flattery, but in Harold Smithe's case, it was also a logistical nightmare. You see, nothing throws off a behavioral analyst like a copycat, especially when that copycat isn't just mimicking your methods, but your mannerisms, your timing, and most offensively, your tea order. It began in Oklahoma City. Bank Subber 85 had all the hallmarks of a classic Harold Job early morning entry: soft-spoken demeanor, note passed with left hand, loose bills only, and a calm, swift exit. The teller described the robber as a pleasant man who looked like he gave thoughtful birthday gifts. The problem: Harold was in Omaha, buying socks. Confirmed by a rare event, Harold had used his library card at 9:17 to check out a book titled The Myth of Security Systems That Lie to Us. Glenn Withers would later describe this detail as so poetic, I nearly sneezed. When the Oklahoma robbery was reported, Glenn's inbox lit up. Same technique, same note phrasing, same walkout timing, down to the second. Only, it wasn't Harold. The footage was off. Slightly. The suspect was too tall. Not enough head tilt. The handwriting was close but lacked the precise downward curl of Harold's lowercase g. It was like watching someone do an impression of a guy you barely noticed in the first place. And the biggest giveaway: he ordered peppermint tea. Harold hated peppermint. Quirky detail. During a layover in 2015, Harold once wrote a Yelp review about a cafe in St. Louis titled Too Minty to Forgive. It received 0 likes. But Glenn found it. Copycat or not, the damage was done. The Oklahoma bank filed its robbery in the same database column as Harold's. The public started to notice. News reports whispered about the gentleman bandit hitting again. The myth grew, Glenn fumed, because this wasn't just criminal confusion, it was data contamination. And for Glenn, who had spent months constructing a behavioral profile so clean it practically wore khakis, this was like someone putting glitter in his alphabet soup. He pulled the footage, watched it on loop. The imposter used all the right tools. Same bag, same tone, same thank you nod, but none of the soul. He was playing Harold like a cover band plays the Beatles. All chords, no magic. But who was he? That's when Glenn noticed something chilling. The imposter had blinked twice, exactly as Harold did before handing the note. But the timing was off. Less fluid. Mechanical. Practiced. Glenn circled the face. Pulled up footage from another bank 2 weeks prior in Tulsa. Different location, different outfit. Same tell. Blink, blink, reach, pass. Another impersonation. He had a fan. Harold Smithe, criminal minimalist, had spawned a movement. Investigators scrambled to determine whether it was a team, some ring of soft-spoken robbers with a flair for post-crime tea, or a single person trying to stir the pot. Meanwhile, Harold noticed the headlines. He didn't like them. You might think that a man who made invisibility his brand would be thrilled to see someone else take the spotlight. But Harold had a code, and that code was cleanliness. The Oklahoma imposter had been sloppy. He'd taken a stack of pre-banded bills, rookie mistake, and triggered the alarm 5 minutes after leaving, due to an embedded dye pack. That dye pack exploded in the men's room of a diner 3 blocks away, creating what witnesses described as a lavender-colored crime cloud. The story made national news. Photos of purple money circulated. And somewhere in Omaha, Harold sat in a diner booth, slowly stirring his chamomile and muttering, "Unbelievable." He didn't like this, because now, the heat was back, not just from federal agents, but from fans, fakers, and folklore. The myth of the polite robber was mutating. He'd gone from a rumor whispered in bank break rooms to the subject of Reddit threads titled things like, "He's just redistributing." Bro. Even worse, Glenn was losing his grip. If other people started copying Harold, The profile would crumble. Fingerprints would overlap. Behavioral signatures would blur. Patterns would dissolve into white noise. So Glenn made a decision. He went public, not with everything, but enough. He wrote a carefully worded internal memo, one he knew would leak, explaining that the real Harold had a unique signature, a 3-step exhalation before he left the counter. Subtle, inaudible, but visible if you knew to look. Within days, analysts were scrubbing footage for the breath. Only Harold had it. The others didn't. And then something curious happened. Banks Nutter 86 was hit in Iowa. Classic Harold style. But the footage confirmed it was him. Glenn knew. The exhale was there. The eye flick, the lean in. The head nod at exactly 17 degrees. But Harold left behind a second note. Not to the teller, to Glenn. It was tucked behind the counter, under the coin tray. It read, "Imitation is a form of noise. Let's see if you can still hear me." It wasn't a taunt. It was a warning. Harold was acknowledging the noise and rising above it. This was his way of saying, "Ignore the karaoke acts. I'm still the headliner." True historical fact. In 1913, the art world was rocked by dozens of Vermeer forgeries so perfect they fooled museums. But one expert and eccentric with color blindness spotted the difference in paint temperature. He didn't see color. He saw feeling. Glenn felt the same way. He didn't analyze criminals. He listened to them. And Harold's tone hadn't changed. The problem was, others were listening too. Copycats multiplied. A Reddit post titled, "I robbed a bank and felt nothing." AMI surfaced. Instagram accounts with usernames like Polite Withdrawal and Chamomile Crime gained traction. Harold's legend was no longer his. It was a meme. And Harold, who had built his empire on being invisible, was now iconic. Back in his motel room, he stared at a news article titled, "The New Face of Crime is Very Sorry." He folded it, packed his bag, and opened his notebook to a blank page. At the top, he wrote, "Rule number 1, don't become the story." Then he crossed it out. Because now, he was the story. And Glenn was already on the road again. Because someone had just reported a man in Wisconsin asking where the nearest bank branch was, and if the barista was to be believed, he'd ordered oolong. Harold didn't drink oolong. It was time to find out who was really holding the teacup. Harold Smithe had become something he never intended a metaphor. He was no longer just a man in khakis who robbed banks politely. He was an idea, one that now had Reddit threads, fan art, and a surprisingly catchy SoundCloud remix featuring actual snippets from teller interviews. He smelled like fresh laundry. Drop the beat. Honestly, I wasn't even mad. Harold hated it. Not because he was modest, though he certainly wore humility like he wore khakis, unwrinkled and poorly tailored, but because the noise made it impossible to work. And Harold loved to work. His robberies were art projects, clean, precise, boring, in the most thrilling way possible. But after the copycats, the tweet, the squirrel logo pen, and the rise of what Glenn Withers now called the tea cult, Harold knew he had to adapt. So he pivoted, not in the flashy, reinvent your brand way. Harold didn't do flashy. He did something far more disturbing. He stopped robbing banks entirely. For 7 weeks, across the country, crime analysts waited. The FBI kept Glenn on a loose leash. TikTok teens speculated, wildly as he dead arrested, living in a monastery in Utah. One particularly viral theory suggested Harold had faked the whole thing as performance art and was now hiding in plain sight teaching yoga in Santa Fe. Glenn wasn't fooled. He knew Harold hadn't vanished. He was refining. Because when Glenn pulled surveillance footage from banks that hadn't been hit but had nearly been robbed incidents where tellers hesitated, where a man asked strange questions about drawer limits, where exit doors jammed mysteriously, he found something odd. A figure, never close enough to identify, but always the same posture, the same deliberate steps, the same pause before the exit. Harold was testing new scripts, not robbing, studying, And then came the diner. A small-town bank in Wisconsin had an incident. Not a robbery, but a disturbance involving a confused teller and a polite man who asked, "What if I needed to withdraw everything?" Conceptually, the teller was so thrown off by the phrasing, she accidentally closed her drawer and triggered the silent alarm. The man apologized, ordered a slice of apple pie from the diner next door, and disappeared before police arrived. Glenn, hearing the details, rolled his eyes so hard he nearly fell off his folding chair. Conceptually, he muttered. He's workshopping philosophical crime. The surveillance footage was blurry, but Glenn caught it, the faint head tilt, the familiar coat, and yes, the signature three-step exhale. Harold had been there, not robbing, just rattling the cage. Let's talk about the passport trick. Up until this point, Harold's method of movement had been a patchwork of bus routes, thrifted luggage, and ticket stubs from strangers' identities. But the longer Glenn watched, the more he realized Harold had pulled off something even bolder. He had figured out how to travel legally without being noticed at all, using a loophole originally designed for military dependents. Harold acquired a gray passport, a real document used by government contractors and logistics personnel to travel on non-classified business without raising red flags. How easy. He'd used a name from a dead man's inactive application file, slipped it through a regional processing office using a forged requisition number, and then never used it on record. The passport was real, the identity was not, and since the gray passport system isn't logged in the same database as commercial travel, Harold effectively became a ghost with TSA clearance. Here's your true fact of the day. The UTSS government once lost track of over 1,200 gray passports in 1999 alone. Several were later found in flea markets, attics, and in one case a retirement home time capsule mislabeled Harold's stuff. Not the same Harold. Probably. Back to our Harold. With the passport trick in play, he could fly again. Quietly, comfortably, more importantly, unpredictably. And yet, Glenn noticed something troubling. Harold had stopped stealing. For a man who had stolen with the regularity of a train schedule, this silence was deafening. Then came the letter. Handwritten, no envelope. Left at the public library, where Glenn occasionally lectured on pattern recognition to retirees who mostly came for the cookies. It read, "The ritual was never about money. You know that. It was about exposure. They exposed me. Now let's see how invisible I can really be." It wasn't signed. Didn't have to be. Glenn knew the handwriting. He also knew that Harold had taken nothing, not the complimentary bookmarks, not even the pen he borrowed to write the note. The message was clear. Harold was done being the myth. Now he wanted to become the anti-myth. The absence. The man you could only find when he wanted you to, and only if you were good enough to catch a ghost that no longer needed to exist. Academic circles started debating a new term, social camouflage collapse. When a person becomes so mythologized that their ability to operate disappears, not because they were caught, but because their existence is now compromised by story. In short, Harold had been too good at being Harold, and now he was shedding it. Glenn sat alone that evening, staring at his corkboard covered in strings, pins, and clippings, half crime data, half art project, and he said, almost affectionately, "You clever, insufferable bastard." But Glenn also knew something Harold didn't. The world was changing. There were new technologies. Facial recognition was evolving. AI-based gait analysis was in trial runs. People were looking harder. And Harold had one flaw. He liked routine. He liked structure. He liked systems. And systems could be traced. So Glenn began to trace one final pattern. Because Harold may have stopped robbing banks, but he hadn't stopped visiting them. In 3 cities over the past 2 months, Glenn discovered Harold had walked into branches, done nothing, and left. No notes, no theft, just presence. He was leaving echoes. Harold had become a rumor you could bump into. And Glenn was getting closer. Because one of those banks had a doorknob with a fingerprint, and someone, finally, was ready to test it. Fingerprint analysis is rarely as dramatic as the movies make it seem. There's no big match found screen with a green circle and a triumphant ding. Mostly, it's a bunch of tired technicians, a lot of enhance that smudge, and somebody eating a burrito too close to sensitive equipment. But when Glenn Withers got the call about the doorknob, he knew it wasn't just another smudge. It was a whisper with oil, ridge detail, and the faint scent of citrus-scented hand sanitizer. The print had been left on the interior handle of a regional bank's side entrance in Columbus. The door wasn't used by customers, just employees, and only one security camera covered it. Poorly. But that morning, a man had been buzzed in by a distracted intern who assumed he was someone's cousin. He wasn't. The man walked down the hallway, nodded at a janitor, and asked, "Is this the branch with the old mural?" before quietly exiting the building. No robbery, no note, no nothing. But the doorknob caught him. It was a partial print, 2 loops, a clean whirl, and for once, it wasn't smudged. The forensics team had something usable. Glenn waited as the system ran the search. It took 2 days. On the 3rd, the result came back. Harold Smithe, real name, real man. And just as Glenn suspected, not an alias, not a ghost, not a fabrication. The match unlocked something else, too. His 1993 employment record from Midlands Regional Bank, including a scanned onboarding form with his signature and, inexplicably, a doodle of a very fat squirrel in the corner. Glenn took it as a sign. But now came the strange part. Harold had just been confirmed alive, present, and physically tied to a location, which meant law enforcement could act. And yet, there was no warrant issued, no task force sent, no helicopter team doing dramatic hand gestures. Because of a technicality, the statute of limitations. Here's your historical fact drop. In most U.S. states, the statute of limitations for bank robbery is 5 years, unless the crime involved a weapon, serious injury, or major federal property. Harold, having been the gentlest of outlaws, triggered none of those conditions in over 70% of his jobs, meaning they couldn't charge him. Well, they could try, but it would be messy. Courts hate slippery cases, jurors hate polite criminals, and PR departments really hate arresting a man whose fans call him the ASMR Robin Hood. Glenn's report reached the Justice Department with a simple summary. The suspect remains highly traceable, yet untouchable. He's become a cautionary tale wrapped in tea leaves and well-folded trousers. And then came the bigger twist. Harold turned himself in. Well, sort of. He walked into a police station in Des Moines, asked to speak with a detective, handed over a folder, and said, "This isn't a confession. It's a clarification." Then he left. No one thought to stop him. Inside the folder were typed pages, neatly formatted, double-spaced, with section headings like "Why I Prefer Bank of the Midwest over Regional Trust Co." and T as disguise a personal exploration. It wasn't a manifesto. It was a user manual, a guide to how he'd done it all without ever threatening anyone, without ever taking more than the insurance would cover, and without once making the nightly news. Taped to the last page was a small post-it. It read, "People don't notice what they don't expect to see." That was the whole trick. Glenn read the folder 3 times. He found no gloating. No apology, either. Just a man explaining how the system made him invisible and how he simply walked through it, again and again, wearing khakis. Here's your quirky fact. Glenn once read a case study about a man who shoplifted TVs by dressing like an employee and wheeling them out the front door while whistling. Security never questioned him, because people see what they believe, not what's there. Harold had simply been the belief. But the real kicker, attached to the folder, was a receipt. From a storage unit rental outside Dayton, Ohio, paid in cash. The name on the file, Mr. Beige. Law enforcement raided the unit within hours. Inside, they found neatly labeled folders with maps of every bank he'd ever hit, 14 pairs of identical khaki pants, size 30 by costs 30, 22 mugs from small-town cafes, a bulletin board covered in teller names and personality notes, and a shoebox labeled "Do Not Spend." Inside the box, $347.90, cash, bundled, untouched. Most of it traceable to the robberies. He had kept it, but never used it. This led to one of the strangest legal debates in modern criminal history. If a man returns what he stole voluntarily, and the statute of limitations has passed, what exactly do you charge him with? The answer: nothing. They tried, but nothing stuck. A misdemeanor trespassing charge for the Columbus hallway incident dismissed. Loitering near an ATM in Spokane. No witness. Alleged impersonation of a small-town financial consultant. No proof. And the T. Perfectly legal. So Harold walked free, and Glenn sat in his office, eating a cinnamon roll with a slightly haunted look, reading over the files, the receipts, the post-it notes full of philosophical musings and grocery lists, because in the end, Harold had done something very few criminals ever do. He'd stolen silence, then handed it back. And just when Glenn thought it was over, a small envelope arrived at his mailbox. Inside, a single tea bag. Green, caffeine-free, organic. Attached was a note. "It's been lovely, but I think I'll try fiction now. H." And on the back, a quote from Marcus Aurelius. "The best revenge is not to be like your enemy. No return address, just a faint scent of lemon balm." Some crimes echo like gunshots, others like whispers. Harold Smithe's legacy, as it turned out, was neither. It was more like the hum of a ceiling fan, barely noticeable unless you're trying to sleep, following his curious pseudo-confession and donation of nearly $350,000 in politely preserved robbery funds. Harold vanished. Again. But this time, no one expected him to return. Not even Glenn Withers. For a man who had spent the better part of his post-retirement years tracing beige blurs across security footage, Glenn now found himself unemployed. Not in the financial sense. The FBI still called him occasionally, mostly to ask what he thought about other cases. But Harold had been his story. The one that kept him awake, kept the crossword clues interesting, kept the cinnamon rolls just chewy enough. And now he had a very large box in his garage labeled Smythe, Harold, 100 banks also tea stuff, and a whiteboard with nothing left to connect. At least, until someone tried to sell the story. A news outlet in Los Angeles ran a headline, "Gentleman Bandit to Tell-All in Netflix Series." It wasn't real. Yet. But it was based on something curious, a call from an entertainment lawyer to a certain literary agent, asking if Mr. Beige was interested in representation. And it made Glenn squint, because Harold had said, "I think I'll try fiction now." Not metaphorically. Literally. The first confirmed sighting happened in Oregon. A small bookstore specializing in slow fiction books designed to be read at dusk while your cat judges you. The owner, Elsa, 62, remembered a man asking for something with light mystery and no shouting. She sold him the Noe One Ladies Detective Agency and a gentleman in Moscow. He left behind a $20 bill and a compliment about the scent of the pine shelves. She remembered him mostly because, later that week, she found a note tucked between the pages of the returned book. It wasn't signed, but the handwriting was meticulous. "Everyone's trying to be seen. I wanted to be remembered by not being noticed." Turns out, that's a kind of fame, too. Glenn, upon reading the note faxed to him by a friend of a bibliophile, chuckled softly. He's monologuing now. He whispered to his cat. Paradox. The man's becoming narrative aware, but the Harold sightings didn't stop. In upstate New York, a bed and breakfast owner swore a very neat man had stayed under the name Harold Smithe, paid in cash, wore slippers, left a sticky note on the mini-fridge that said, "Appreciated the chamomile selection." In Toronto, a barista claimed someone matching Harold's description had spent an hour writing in a notebook titled, working title, "The Man Who Didn't Take Anything." In Texas, A local newspaper received a manila envelope containing a short story, titled The Withdrawal, about a man who robs banks so politely that the tellers start tipping him. No return address, no signature. But Glenn knew. Harold wasn't just hiding anymore. He was writing himself. It raised fascinating questions. Was he documenting, rewriting, reflecting? Was it memoir or myth-making? The lines were blurring faster than Glenn's reading glasses could keep up with. Academic circles started to take notice. One criminology professor referred to Harold as the first postmodern criminal. A Reddit thread called him the Banksy of banking, and someone even tried to pitch a musical titled Smythe, The Musical Polite, Crimes Only. But Glenn didn't care about the noise. He cared about Part 101. That's what Harold had labeled it in one of his documents, a mysterious heading at the very end of the folder he left behind. Part 101, The Final Robbery. No cash taken, no description, no timestamp. Just that title. Glenn read it over and over, and slowly, the theory emerged. Harold had never robbed for money. He'd robbed for control, narrative control, emotional equilibrium. Every job was a push against the structure that had once made him invisible. But Part 101, that was the story, the final act. Not a robbery, but a performance. One last moment in a bank, but this time, not to take anything. Not even a pen. So Glenn waited. Not in a command center, not in a car, but in a cafe. In a town where Harold had once worked. A branch he'd never hit. A place with creaky chairs and mismatched mugs. And one Tuesday morning, it happened. A man entered the cafe. Late 40s. Glasses. Khakis. He ordered Earl Grey. Sat down. Opened a notebook. Wrote 2 sentences. Stood up. Left. Glenn didn't follow. He didn't need to. Because on the table, where the man had been, was the notebook. Inside was a story. Fictional, supposedly, about a man who robbed banks, then gave the money back, quietly, with no demands, just resolutions. At the bottom of the final page, this was the withdrawal I was always making. Not from banks, from being ignored. And underneath that, a single word. Good night. Glenn closed the notebook, took a deep breath, and didn't file a report. Because Harold hadn't committed a crime, he'd just written the ending. But endings are tricky things. Some fade, some echo, and some, like Harold Smithe, fold themselves into the creases of other people's memories. The man who robbed 100 banks, who apologized while doing it, who became invisible on purpose, who returned everything, who disappeared again. Except now, he left stories behind. Harold had become folklore, and Glenn finally finished his crossword. Clue 1 who leaves no mark, yet rewrites the rules. 6 letters. Answer Smythe. Some endings unravel gently. Others arrive like a final note in a song you didn't realize was playing. And sometimes if you're Harold Smithe, they arrive exactly as planned. Wrapped in linen paper, scented with black tea, and left in a place no one should have access to. It was Glenn who found it. Not in a bank, not in a cafe, but in a library, specifically the archive room of the Midwest Historical Depository in Indiana. Glenn had been invited to give a lecture titled Criminal Patterns in Low-Violence Offenders, which he accepted only because the event offered free danishes and a room with carpeting that didn't smell like damp basement. After the talk, Glenn wandered, as he often did when his brain buzzed too much to go home. He ended up in a dusty back room full of discarded microfiche, reels, and forgotten pamphlets. He reached for one at random bank design in the 1970s, efficiency or ego, because of course he did. Tucked behind the pamphlet was a slim brown envelope. Inside it, a map and a note. There's one bank left. You missed it. Not because I robbed it, but because I didn't. Glenn unfolded the map. Hand-drawn. A town he recognized, Spruce Bluff. Population 3406, known primarily for its annual festival of slightly above average corn. The map showed the bank, circled, but with a big X drawn through it. This was always supposed to be the first job, but I chickened out. So it became the last one, just never happened. This was Part 101, the final robbery that never happened. Back in his car, Glenn thought long and hard about what that meant. A crime planned, but not executed. Was it guilt sentiment A test? Or had Harold been writing his own loophole into history, leaving one job undone so that his tally never reached a clean 100? Philosophers, of course, would love this. An unfinished pattern. A refusal to complete the ritual. A deliberate act of incompletion so that the story could never fully resolve. He drove to Spruce Bluff the next morning. The bank was real, still standing, beige, naturally, built in 1973. One teller on duty, who offered Glenn a butterscotch candy and asked if he was from the county fair committee. He said yes, because why not? The lobby was clean, untouched. No cameras, no motion detectors. It was like a relic from an earlier time, a time before Harold, or maybe exactly during Harold. And Glenn saw it on the back wall, above the brochures about home loans and family trusts. A squirrel, a tiny carved wood relief, handcrafted. And in the squirrel's paw, a tiny book. Glenn smiled. It wasn't just an unrobbed bank. It was a message. This was where it all started. Where Harold had wanted to begin, and didn't. Where he tested himself and walked away. The one time he said no, and in doing so, made the rest of the story possible. Here's your quirky detail in the break room of that bank. The microwave is held shut with a rubber band. It's been broken since 2008. No one has fixed it. The manager just says, well, it still mostly works. Harold would have appreciated that. Glenn stood in the lobby for a few minutes longer. Not because he needed to, just because it felt like standing inside a chapter that hadn't been written. And he realized something. Harold hadn't vanished. He had closed the loop. The robberies weren't random. They were chapters, entries in a ledger only he could read. And this bank, unrobbed, was the final punctuation mark, a deliberate non-action to end a life of hyper-disciplined subtlety. It was elegant. It was invisible. It was so Harold. Later that evening, Glenn found a manila folder waiting on his motel pillow. No staff had seen anyone enter. No cameras at the door. Just a slightly warm pillow and the faintest scent of lemon balm. The folder contained a short story. The Man Who Didn't Rob the Last Bank. By It read like fiction, but every paragraph pulsed with autobiography. A man enters a bank. He doesn't pass a note, doesn't scan the exits, doesn't breathe in thirds. He just looks around and realizes, for the first time, that he doesn't need to vanish anymore. Because being seen wasn't about spectacle, it was about intention, and his had been fulfilled. At the bottom of the story, a line in block letters. There's nothing left to withdraw. Glenn closed the folder. No fanfare, no agents, no arrests. Just a quiet nod to a man who robbed banks without anyone noticing, and then stopped not because he had to, but because he'd finished. Back home, Glenn boxed up his notes. He labeled the box Fictional Behavior Study, Soccer 43. He didn't tell anyone, not because it was a secret, but because, somehow, the silence felt more honest. And when asked later what happened to Harold Smithe, Glenn would say, he left through the side door, the one we were too busy staring at the vault to notice, because in the end, Harold didn't take gold. He took perception and left behind a perfect silence. Harold Smithe had disappeared so quietly, you might have missed it even if you were staring directly at him. That was always his trick, not a vanishing act, but a dissolving one, fading not with smoke and mirrors, but with manners and predictable walking speed. But something strange happened in the months after his final breadcrumb in Spruce Bluff. People started looking for him. Not investigators, not journalists. Ordinary people. Librarians, bus drivers, former tellers. They weren't hoping to arrest him. They were just curious. Drawn in like characters in a bedtime story who'd woken up and realized the storyteller had left the room. Some claimed to spot him. A man folding sweaters at a consignment shop in Vermont. A bookstore clerk in Oregon who always shelved the mystery section alphabetically by crime type. A soft-spoken walker who visited a dog park in Arizona without a dog, but with a thermos of Earl Grey. The sightings were always gentle, always polite, and always unverifiable. Glenn Withers kept track of them. Of course. Not in an official sense, his whiteboard had long since been scrubbed clean, but in a leather-bound journal he called maybes. He'd sit on his porch with a cup of decaf and read through these accounts like postcards from an old friend who never signed his name. Some were clearly false. One described Harold as a man with wild eyes and a ponytail who spoke only in riddles. Glenn snorted. Harold would never have tolerated a ponytail. But some felt real. The details were too subtle. To Harold. He said the bank floor tiles were misaligned by 2 millimeters. He complimented the coffee and pointed out a blind spot in the security camera. He wrote a Yelp review titled "Satisfactory Experience," minus the peppermint. It was as if Harold wasn't hiding anymore. He was wandering, and maybe that's the difference between a fugitive and a folk tale. One runs from pursuit, the other strolls into myth. Glenn often wondered why Harold hadn't tried to cash in. He could have sold his story, signed a book deal, opened a tea shop with minimalist branding and crime-themed scones, the scone of silence, sticky note biscuit, chamomile con. But Harold didn't care about attention. He cared about control. He'd controlled the narrative of his life so precisely, so consistently, that even in his absence, the story moved the way he would have wanted it to, quietly, calmly, without fireworks. And so Glenn started doing what Harold had done for years, observing without interfering. He visited old banks, sat at cafes, smiled at quiet men in beige. He didn't chase. He listened, once, in a Denver airport bookstore. Glenn spotted a paperback titled "The Man Who Asked Politely." The author was listed as S.E. The plot. A series of fictional interviews with tellers who may or may not have been robbed. Each story ended with a single cup of tea, untouched. Glenn bought the book, left a $20 bill in the back as a tip, just in case Harold had a deal with the clerk. Then there was the time Glenn received a box in the mail. No return address. Inside, a library card, a mug, and a packet of green tea. The library card wasn't valid anymore, but the name was real. Harold Smythe. The mug said, "I survived 100 banks and all I got was this cup." Glenn laughed. A long, wheezing, almost startled laugh that left his cat Paradox too. His first had passed quietly, as was tradition, staring at him with mild concern. That mug sat on Glenn's desk from then on, not as a trophy, as a bookmark, because Harold's story hadn't ended. It had just moved to the footnotes. Let's take a quick philosophical turn, shall we? There's an idea in literary theory called narrative latency. It's when a character disappears from the story, but their influence deepens. They become more present by being absent. The way a shadow tells you where the light used to be. Harold became the patron saint of narrative latency. You couldn't see him anymore, but suddenly, every polite stranger in a bank, every oddly phrased request, every person who ordered tea in a travel mug with a wry smile, felt a little suspicious. He'd turned mundanity into mystery, which, Glenn realized, was the greatest theft of all. Not the money, not the headlines, but the attention. Harold had stolen our sense of certainty about ordinary people. And then, gently, he gave it back. But he left a crease in the page. Glenn found himself writing again. Not reports, not briefings. Fiction. He began a story called "The Man Who Sat Down and Didn't Leave." It was about a stranger in a small town who never committed a crime, but made everyone around him better at noticing things. He didn't say who inspired it. Didn't need to. The point wasn't the name. The point was the pattern. And out there somewhere, Harold was probably reading it. Probably sipping tea. Probably folding the edge of the page just enough to mark his place. Not as an ending, but as a pause. Because maybe, just maybe, he had one more part left. And Glenn, he'd be waiting. In the final recorded sighting, if you believe it, Harold Smithe was seen at a used bookstore in Maine, buying a dictionary and returning 3 small volumes anonymously in a paper bag. The store clerk said he wore corduroy this time, not khakis. That may have been the most unbelievable part of the whole report. There were no more robberies, no more notes, no more teacups left half full near security cameras. Harold had, at long last, stepped off the stage, or maybe into the wings, still watching. A man whose life had once been a meticulously arranged sequence of subtle movements and quiet thefts now appeared to be living like anyone else. If anyone else had a reputation for robbing 100 banks and never being seen doing it, Glenn Withers, now fully retired again, kept a single locked drawer in his study. Inside a folder titled Smythe, H, and a post-it that simply read, Unsolved on purpose. He had stopped chasing long ago, not because he couldn't catch Harold, but because Harold no longer needed to be caught. The performance was over. The archive was closed. And yet, Glenn still felt him, not as a presence, but as a design. He began noticing the patterns in other things, how the man at the hardware store always paid in cash and wore shirts without logos, how the coffee shop regular only ever sat with his back to the wall, how someone had rearranged the books in the true crime section at his local library in perfect alphabetical order by unsolved case. Harold had taught him something. That being invisible wasn't a trick, it was a philosophy. In a world obsessed with attention, Harold had mastered the art of passing through it like fog through trees. No drama, no legacy. Just a smudge on the window you weren't sure had ever been there. Back at Glenn's house. Paradox 2 curled on the windowsill as Glenn made his tea. Green. 2 minutes steep. No sugar. The mug the one Harold had sent was chipped now, and Glenn liked it that way. Imperfect. Honest. He sat down, opened a small leather notebook, and jotted down the day's observations. Woman at post office wearing identical beige coat. Bus driver looked directly at me. Didn't smile. Harold move. Library checkout system offline for 14 minutes. Smythe interference, probably not. But maybe. He didn't write these out of paranoia. He wrote them because they amused him. Because somewhere, Harold might be reading over his shoulder. The world had never formally closed the book on Harold Smithe. No grand jury, no televised confession. Just a man who appeared, politely declined to stay, and vanished on his own terms. There are whispers that a manuscript was found, fictionalized, naturally. A novella about a man who steals things people didn't know were missing time. Certainty. Silence. It ends with him returning a library book that was never checked out, and the librarian realizing it contained only one sentence. Thank you for noticing me. That story hasn't been published. Not yet. But if it ever is, you'll know it by its dedication. For G, who looked past the vault and saw the door, and you'll close the book. Smile quietly to yourself, and maybe check to see if your pen is still there. It probably is, but you'll wonder anyway. Because that's the Harold effect. He doesn't steal what's yours. He steals what you assumed was certain. One unguarded moment at a time. And so it ends. Not with a chase. Not with a trial. But with a library card. A missing pen. And a question you'll ask yourself tomorrow when the bank teller smiles just a little too kindly. Would I have noticed him? Probably not. And that, dear listener, is exactly the point. Let it sit with you a while. Let the edges of the story fade like breath on glass. Let the rhythm slow.